Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Adijan Ayanar. For the past 2 years, Turkey and the European Union have seen relations worsen across a number of channels. But one major sticking point, and that is EU's promises to help shoulder the cost of millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey, has seen some progress. Recently, EU bloc leaders agreed to release the final $3.5 billion installment as part of a refugee deal. As part of that deal, which was signed back in March 2016, Turkey agreed to secure its borders and host refugees passing through on the condition that the EU gave certain concessions. The agreement included a $7 billion payment that would support Syrian refugees in Turkey, the EU to re-energize accession talks, and for the bloc to grant visa-free travel for Turkish nationals. And with the recent re-election of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, hopes were high that this positive momentum would continue. But earlier this month, Ankara and Berlin ignited a new spat after the closure of a German embassy school in Izmir over licensing issues. Turkish officials also recently warned that they will have minimum dialogue with the new EU term president Austria. Last month, Austria announced it would be closing several mosques and expelling dozens of Turkish imams. The move prompted strong condemnation from Ankara. So, where are Turkey-EU ties headed? And what impact will an executive presidency have on relations? To discuss this, I'm now joined by Oguz Demir. He's an associate professor of economics at Istanbul's Ticaret University, and Achilles Skordas, who is a professor of international law at the University of Bristol. Gentlemen, good to have you here on Straight Talk. Oguz, let's start with you. Now, accession talks between Turkey and the European Union have been going on for decades now. There have been good times and not so good times. But last Sunday, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had an overwhelming victory in the elections, in the presidential elections. How will Turkey move forward with a presidency with extended powers with its relations with the European Union in this new chapter?
Yeah, to be honest, when we look to Erdogan's position for a while, he was very much opposed by the European leaders, European Parliament, and some other institutions in the Europe. So, and it was always a payback or backfire by Erdogan that he was being elected. He's trying to improve the democracy within the country, and he was always trying to convince those European leaders that Turkey is sticking to the EU membership process.
Under a new system of governance, with a presidency which holds more powers, how is Turkey going to move down this path?
If the President Erdogan and his team will go back to the EU membership path again, if they decide this, that's going to be faster when you compare with the past process, because now they can go forward with the decisions that they can do because they have the legislative power now.
Where does the European Union see Turkey? We know that it sees it as a valuable potential partner, but there are some countries that have been reluctant in terms of Turkey's accession. Let's be realistic. And it's particularly because of perhaps President Erdogan's rhetoric, his style of governance. We know that after Sunday's elections that President Erdogan will lead Turkey for at least another 5 years. Is there a sense in Europe that's, all right, we're going to have to deal with it since President Erdogan's on the top for another 5 years?
Well, I think we should distinguish the dimension of the person from the dimension of the structural problems between the European Union and Turkey. Elections create emotions, they personalize the issues, and this is what happened in the period leading up to the Turkish presidential election. Now this emotional dimension is over, and what remain are the structural problems. And when I read the report of the Commission on the Turkish accession process of 2018, what I can see is that there is a fundamental incompatibility between the two systems. Turkey takes a path which is not consistent with what the Europeans understand as a liberal democracy. And let's not forget, Europe, the European Union, is not an international organization as any other. It is a club of liberal democracies. And the fact that now you have an executive presidency is seen in Europe sometimes as a problem because it muddles somehow the separation of power and the checks and balances in a governance system. So in a sense, the problems are deeper and structural with regard to the accession. That said, Turkey is a strategic partner of Europe on a realist perspective and on the level of international relations. And the tensions that we have are part of the fact that we want to be something more than simply two strategic partners. We want to belong one day to one family. And the question is whether Turkey likes that path of Europe, whether Turkey can fit into the European system.
Oğuz, strategic partners, but there are some structural issues. Now that Austria has taken over the term presidency of the European Union, and we know that it's not the most desired sort of choice in terms of Turkey, with Chancellor Sebastian Kurz and the government there vehemently opposed to Turkey's accession. Can we see any real progress?
We know that Austria has been one of the biggest opposition in the Turkish EU membership process. It's not only about the Sebastian Kurz, but it's also about the Austria's position to Turkey for a while. So what we can say in that sense, Turkey and EU relations in the upcoming 6 months will not have too many progress. But it's not only about Austria one side, you know, because in the last 3-4 years, the negotiations are only in the technical level. In the political sense, it's not progressing. So there, you know, both sides are blaming each other in some topics, in the structural problems. But also, the only thing, as I said before, the only deal we had with the EU for a while is the Syrian issue. So that is the main problem. For example, the Turkish government is asking for the European leaders to operate with the visa-free regime for Turkish students. We know that Georgia, Ukraine, and some other countries got this right to do, but still Turkish is waiting in the door.
Okay. Achilles, help us understand sort of, is the European Union's stance unified when it comes to sort of Turkey's membership in the European Union? Are there countries that are more against it or more for it?
Yeah. Let me first make a comment on the question of visas. I also agree that visa freedom must be granted to Turkish citizens. I don't agree with the position of the Union that Turkey must make all these changes in its counter-terrorism legislation before the visa freedom is being granted. However, I'm not so pessimistic about the EU-Turkey relations during the Austrian presidency, precisely because the Austrian presidency wants to manage the migration problem, and without Turkey this is not possible. So we may see, that can be my wild speculation, that perhaps the center of gravity will move from the accession process to a more international cooperation, where we leave on the side the internal issues that we have, and we are looking to the international scene. Because here, let's not forget that the migration problem is part of Turkey's geopolitical problem as well, because at the Turkish border there is a chaotic situation development. The Middle East and North Africa region is collapsing.
Europe is dealing with the biggest migration crisis since the end of World War II. When you look at the core values of the European Union, the respect for human rights, the respect for human dignity, the rule of law, are we seeing this crisis sort of challenge these core values and relations with Turkey?
Mm-hmm. It does indeed. I admit that. But let me make here a point which is somehow ignored in the discussion, that Europe is a normative power, it's a soft power, it's a human rights power, so wants it to demonstrate itself. It's a liberal power, but it's also a realist power. When you see the treaties, the Treaty on the European Union, the core element of the foreign policy of the Union is to preserve its fundamental interests, its independence and its security. Therefore, imagine now an entity like the Union with 27 or 28 still member states getting this inflow of migration, not just the 1 or 2 million that we have got now, but you see a whole continent prepared to move in Europe if the circumstances permit it. This is a situation which challenges the basic order principles of the Union. And one of the basic principles of the Union which is challenged is the free movement of persons within the Union. So you need to understand that the Union here responds in a realist manner. And because it responds in a realist manner vis-à-vis the migration crisis, that's why I believe it can respond in a realist manner vis-à-vis Turkey on the level of international relations.
Oguz, let me ask you, the releasing of these last tranche of $3.5 billion, it's been a strained topic for the Turkish side, always with the Turks with a bad taste in their mouth, saying the Europeans have never given us the money that they've promised. Is this sort of maybe a stepping stone, maybe so relations can move in the right direction?
No, I don't think so. It was the part of the deal that the EU should complete. Because this deal was a deal with 3 billion euros to be donated to Turkey for the sake of the migrants in Turkey. And the Turkish government was supposed to control its borders for not letting the people to go or to flow to Europe. And Turkey got this responsibility for a while, since the beginning of this deal. The fundamental problems, the structural problems are just sitting there. And we're just limiting Turkey-EU relations to the migration deal or the refugee deal. And I think this is the biggest unfair thing that we're doing to this relation. It's limiting it to the visa-free travel, limiting it to the refugee deal. These are just some kind of deals that we have been doing, like with Russia or with some other countries. But we are expecting for both parties to be closer to each other, to complete an accession process. And now it's behaved like Turkey is a strategic partner. Turkey is an international partner for solution of the EU's problems. It's like a stakeholder. No, these problems are joint problems.
Oguz Demir and Achilles Skordas, thank you very much for joining us here on Straight Talk.